Hello and welcome to Matcha Mornings, part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network. I'm your host, Amanda Kingsmith, and I'm excited to dive deep on topics around holistic health, the power of food, hormone health, how the practices of yoga can impact our health and well-being, and much more. So grab your cup of tea, settle in, and let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Matcha Mornings podcast. I'm really excited that you're joining me for today's episode of the show. And today I am thrilled to be joined by my dear friend and fellow yoga teacher and yoga business coach, Shannon Crow. Shannon is the founder of The Connected Yoga Teacher, a popular podcast and private Facebook community supporting yoga teachers, as well as the founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. Shannon has a background and expertise in pelvic health, and this is something that she's really passionate about. And this is what we're going to be diving into today on the podcast. We're talking a little bit about Shannon's background with pelvic health, how she got into this, how this became her specialization. And then we're talking about all the things that you need to know about your pelvis, regardless of if you are a yoga teacher, a movement practitioner, a man, a woman. This information is relevant to you. And on this episode, we dive into how having pain in your pelvis, or maybe what you're identifying as your hips or your lower back, is not necessarily normal, and how we can look at this pain or discomfort we might be having and identify it as something that's going on with our pelvis, and then look at rehabilitating either with a professional or on our own. And Shannon has some really good tips and resources for that. So I am super excited to dive into this episode, and without further ado, here is Shannon. Welcome to the podcast today, Shannon. I'm really excited to have you here with me today.
I am so excited to be here, Amanda. It's so fun to hang out and chat and be able to also connect with your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I have a lot of off the air conversations, which I always love. And it's cool to be able to connect on the podcast. And this is especially cool because you and I have had conversations on the business side of things, and it's fun to kind of switch it up and talk more and a little bit deeper about pelvic health. I know we've talked a little bit about it on MBO, but to really dive deep into it. But before we get into that, can you just introduce yourself briefly to listeners?
Sure. My name is Shannon Crow. I use the pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm a fellow Canadian like Amanda. It just snowed here today, and that feels like, okay, enough already. I'd like spring. I'm also a mom of three, a yoga teacher, and the founder of Pelvic Health Professionals, a group where yoga teachers and other health professionals all learn about pelvic health together.
Amazing. You have so much good stuff on the go. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your backstory with pelvic health, like just what kind of brought you into this world of learning about this and specializing in it.
Well, it was before I became a yoga teacher, I had studied anatomy in college. And then when I became a yoga teacher, I had definitely studied anatomy and physiology there as well. I gave birth to 3 babies, which means that you'd think that I should at that point know a lot about my pelvis and how it works. But really, I didn't. I started to realize I focused and specialized in pre and postnatal yoga. And then I would hire pelvic health PTs. So here in Canada, we call those physiotherapists. Other places call them physical therapists. And I hired them to come in and do that portion of teacher training. And I quickly realized there were so many things that I needed to know about my own body, and that yoga teachers needed to know about their students' bodies that weren't being covered in yoga teacher training. And so I was diagnosed with Diastasis Recti, which was from my pregnancies. The tissue at the linea alba had become weakened, and some of the yoga that I was actually doing was making it worse. I didn't know that. I was experiencing low back pain and hip pain, and I didn't know how this connected with all of it. Fast forward a little bit later, I often would have quote unquote hip pain, or I would think that my pelvis wasn't in alignment since having my kids. And I started to really learn from people who were in the space of yoga, but definitely physiotherapy and also pain science, and started to have a totally different conversation about my own pelvis, and then saw this work for many other people. So I went on to work one-on-one in a physiotherapy office as someone who specialized in yoga for pelvic health. So I worked with the team there. They would see people for different things like pelvic organ prolapse, incontinence, whatever, anything going on in the pelvis. And so that's why I'm so excited to bring this information out to everyone. Like, I literally think every human with a pelvis walking the planet needs to know this.
Yeah, that story is really inspiring to hear. And I completely agree. I remember the first time that you and I connected, which would have been, like 4 years ago at this point, I think. I remember you were talking about getting into pelvic health, and I was like, wow, I know very little about pelvic health or my pelvis in general. And I was thinking about how, I was a 200-hour registered yoga teacher at that point. I was teaching public classes. And I guess I'd always thought about this idea of like, my pelvis doesn't really matter until probably after childbirth. And I know now from learning from you and reading a little bit more about it, that that's definitely not the case. I'd love to dive into a little bit around like, what do we need to know about our pelvis? What are some common misconceptions when it comes to pelvic health and some of that good stuff?
Well, I think the one thing, so common myths and misconceptions or things we need to know is that, I think the biggest one is that any pain or discomfort in the pelvis, a lot of the time we're told, especially as women, that, oh, well, you'll just have this pain, like it comes along with menstruation. This is just the way life is. And I would question that. So when we start having, like you said, oh, I thought these things will hit after I have children. A lot of people believe that. And that's when we see like incontinence, pelvic girdle pain, pelvic organ prolapse. And a lot of people are living with these things thinking, well, this is just what it means to age and to have children. And I think that's the biggest myth, especially around pelvic girdle pain. And I would love to really help anyone who's dealing with, quote unquote, most people call it hip pain or low back pain. I think that's the biggest thing, is the myth of like, I'm in pain, I just have to live with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like I hear this a lot just as I entered my 30s and whatnot. It was, people were like, oh, it just goes downhill from here and your body's just going to start hurting more. And I feel like as a movement educator and practitioner, I'm sort of like, well, aren't there ways that we can make sure that we're not in pain? Like, it seems like we're not designed as humans to just live in pain. And there's, things we can do to kind of make sure that we're not in pain. And I would imagine that the same thing is true of our pelvis and our pelvic health. And so you mentioned that people often identify, pelvic pain as hip pain or lower back pain. Can we talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So it's easier for me now to lump this all in and call it all pelvic girdle pain. So if you think of the entire pelvis all the way from the top, if someone says to you, or especially when you're a kid, if someone was like, bring your hands to your hips, in your gym class or whatever, you most generally bring your hands to the very top of the pelvis, which is really confusing because that's not where our hips are. But that's why students will often say to me, oh, I have hip pain. And so that's when I ask them to say, or to show me, like, where is this pain that you're feeling? Because I want to figure out where is it. It's generally in the pelvis. So for your people out there who are yoga practitioners or yoga teachers, or really like learning more about their body, or anyone who wants to learn about the pelvis, I would say like get a visual, get an anatomy picture of the pelvis and have a look at it online. They're everywhere. You can find them everywhere. And I actually have a handout that I can give to Amanda so that all of you can see the pelvis from the top to the bottom, but also feel it at the very top of the pelvis. to the very bottom. So your sits bones, if you've ever been in yoga class, the yoga teacher is often talking about sits bones. That's the bottom of the pelvis. And the top, you can feel it's right below your ribs usually. Usually they're pretty close. And so pelvic girdle pain is pain anywhere in that pelvis. That includes the very front, that pubic symphysis. The back, there's two joints at the back called the sacroiliac joints. And then also our hip joints, where our femur bone comes into the hip socket, and the tailbone. So those are the spots that generally people will point to and say, here's where my hip pain is. And I don't argue with people and say, this isn't hip pain. But if we're yoga teachers, movement educators, and we're working with people within the medical world, like our PTs, doctors, gynecologists, all of those people, because I think we really can be part of that team, it's important that we call it what it is. And pelvic girdle pain also means it's just liberating. It's like it's somewhere in the pelvis and it's up to our doctor or our pelvic health PT to diagnose what it is and go a little bit deeper. But when we're in a yoga class or we're moving in life, there are lots of overall things that we can try out and see if it makes a difference when we have this pelvic girdle pain. So that's why I like to take out the word hip pain. It's kind of a long answer.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And I appreciate the description of kind of where the pelvis is in general, because I think that, sometimes we do just have these things like hip pain, and, hip pain to you might be different than hip pain to me, then it might be different to, person C who might be experiencing something similar too. And so I think identifying kind of what that is and what it can be is an important part of this. And before we kind of get into how we can take care of this, I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, like the prevention side, and maybe more specifically for women. And the reason why this comes up for me is I was on a call with some friends the other day, and one of my friends gave birth in the last year and a half, and she's looking to start trying for her second soon. And she's been working with her PT around, her pelvic health and her pelvic strength, because she got, is it recti? What is the word when your like abs split apart?
Diastasis recti.
Yeah, diastasis recti. That's what she had. And so, her doctor and her PT is now trying to make sure that she's like more prepared, I guess, physically for her second pregnancy. And she's like, I really wish that I would have known about this beforehand. And so I'm curious if we can talk about this sort of like, even if we're not having pain, what can we be doing to take care of our pelvis?
Right. So the very first thing that I would say to do, and your friend learned this kind of the hard way, is go see a pelvic health PT. Here in Canada, it's not paid for, even though we have amazing free health care. So a lot of people will say to me, well, it's not paid for where I am. Neither is going to the dentist here in Canada, and we all figure out how to do it. It's like this person specializes in looking at your pelvis. And also, if you think about the pelvis, it really connects with the entire body. So something really cool, but also painful, is when people have where they're really clenching their jaw and they're feeling pain in their jaw. There are many studies that directly relate that to someone holding a lot of tension in their pelvic floor. So we know that different things that go on in the body impact the pelvis and vice versa. So I would say, first of all, definitely go see a pelvic health PT. For people who are interested in learning more about diastasis recti, we did a great podcast on that because there's new information out there. The confusing thing about diastasis recti, and I just want to touch on this before we move into another thing about the pelvis and pelvic girdle pain, is there's a lot of misinformation out there about it. It literally translates to separation of the rectus abdominis muscles, but we know that that's no longer true. So there's a great episode with Dr. Sinead Dufour, and she might even be someone that you might want to have here talk more in depth about diastasis recti. She's great to talk to about that. And it's really looking at the tissue of the linea alba instead of that separation. But
and the tissue of the linea alba is
right along the belly button.
Okay.
Line. So the rectus abdominis muscles, those six-pack abs that we have, they're important. They're important for holding in our intestines, right? And they do work a little bit with the core, but they're not really our deep, deep core muscles. I don't want to say that they're not important. They are. I think they get focused on a lot because they're right at a place where we hold a lot of vulnerability as humans, right at our stomach sort of area, or our belly, our abdomen. And it's like a whole other podcast of like, stop holding in your stomachs, really like allow your body to breathe and move, wear clothing that allows you to breathe and move there. And this goes right back to going to see a pelvic health PT. They really will customize whatever you need, because we develop some pretty interesting habits with our breath, with our movement patterns, with our bathroom habits, and they get into all of that. And I feel like not a lot of people are talking about it. The other thing with the pelvis is I want you to really, when you feel your own pelvis, or if you go to, say, your chiropractor or your pelvic health PT or someone and they have one there, you'll notice, and I want you to think about how strong and stable the pelvis is, because we have a lot of misinformation going right now that the pelvis is like wobbly or unstable, or you'll hear movement educators say, oh, I need to do this movement to stabilize my pelvis. I used to say this as well as a yoga teacher and as someone who was trying to have less pelvic girdle pain. And it just isn't helpful language. The pelvis it's built to be strong and stable. And as I personally know, sometimes the pelvis is sensitive and protective. So we feel that pain. That pain isn't all in our mind. It's not just imagined. I have experienced a lot of pain in my SI joint over the years and gone to many body workers and had the language fed to me then of, we need to stabilize your pelvis, or we need to do this thing to make your pelvis, the muscles around your pelvis stronger, or, and so I've taken that language out. I tell myself now, oh, we're having a more sensitive and protective day. Okay, I'm going to pull out my list of things to do today that will help.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious, how, so the pelvis is pretty stable, yet we can have pain happening in it. What is kind of happening then when we're experiencing pelvic girdle pain if it's not instability?
Yeah, this is so interesting. I feel like we could do days and days of podcasts, but I would definitely start to look at some of the pain science, because we know that the body gives pain messages for a reason. I would suggest even looking into the work of Carolyn Van Dyken, Shelley Prosko is a yoga teacher, Neil Pearson. These are some people who I follow and learn from about why we feel that pain. And what I would love for you to try, something that's really worked for me, is the mindset of my pelvis is strong and stable. Today, it's sensitive and protective. So that means I am going to change the way I do my yoga practice, the way I stand, the way I sit, the way I get in and out of my car, the way I roll over. And I can go through those things actually with you if you want. I'll change those things. And that, just even that language alone stops that, the conversation. And I want to highlight this with a story. So I had a yoga student coming to see me. She was on baby number 2. She was coming to our group yoga class. She was 9 months pregnant, dealing with a lot of pelvic girdle pain. And she had a little bit of pelvic girdle pain in pregnancy number 1, but there was a lot in pregnancy number 2. And she said, I just feel like my pelvis is coming apart. Like, I feel like it's not going to hold together. And I had been learning a lot with Dr. Sinead Dufour and all of these pain experts. And so we did the class, and I worked at modifying some of the movements that she was doing, like going over and checking in with her and really seeing, is this helping or is this making the pelvis feel more sensitive and protective? And I know she was really upset by the end of the class because she just wasn't able to move, and she loved coming to class. And so I took the time at the end of class to have a conversation with her about it, because I know that as much as we feel pain in our bodies, it's very much about what our nervous system is going through. It's very much what our brain is telling us and what our body is telling our brain. Like that, there's a book, The Body Keeps Score, that's really good on this. And also, I know from having pelvic girdle pain, it's not all in your head. Like that just doesn't help someone who's dealing with pain. So we had a long conversation, and it boiled down to, she started talking to me about her pregnancies, and we went through that. And then she started talking to me about a car accident that she was in her early 20s. She was fine in the car. She was really scared, obviously. She was physically okay. It was quite traumatic for her. And she remembers walking into a store because she had to go get something and then peeing her pants in the store. Very traumatic, especially in your early 20s. For anyone, really. Mm-hmm. And she talked about that. And right then, like, I clarified with her, are you seeing a counselor? Because that's not my role as a yoga teacher. I was there listening, and I wanted her to talk to me about, she was upset about the class and that she couldn't move. And I was there listening and holding space. But I want to make sure as a yoga teacher, I'm always, referring someone to a counselor if they don't already have one, or a pelvic health PT. She was already seeing a pelvic health PT, and she was seeing a counselor on and off. So she told me that she was going to go see her counselor. The next week, she walked into class with like no pain and told me, oh my gosh, like I talked to my counselor all about, this car accident and the pressures of having baby number 2 and this pregnancy. And she's like, I don't know what's happened, but I literally don't have that pain this week. And I'm like, that's amazing. Like, I'm not saying that's going to be it for everyone, do the counseling. But I am saying, if you've been dealing with pain that's lasted beyond 11 to 12 weeks, which is what it takes tissue to heal, then start to look at other things. And I'm one that has to do this. Like, I know that I will have persistent pain through my life for some reason in my body, in my pelvis. And I know the things that make a difference. And the biggest thing is that mental piece of like knowing my pelvis is strong and stable. And then knowing that it also has days where it's more sensitive and protective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that that's just a really good reminder of this connection between like mental, physical, emotional, spiritual. We can't really separate those one and then the other. And of course we can look at, maybe something that's going on mentally or emotionally or spiritually versus something physically. But, these things can be playing into our body. And I've read The Body Keeps the Score, I think twice now, and I probably do for a reread. It's such an amazing book with so much good information. And I remember the first time I read it was probably like 2014, I think. So I guess like almost 7 years ago at this point. And just thinking to myself, like, wow, this makes so much sense, because sometimes we just have these experiences physically that we can't really explain. And once we kind of, clear some of the emotional gunk out or the mental gunk out, we are able to kind of release ourselves from this pain. So I think that that's a really good reminder. And then also I love the sort of mantra or inner work that you were talking about with just saying, my pelvis is strong and stable, and acknowledging if you're having a day where maybe it's feeling a bit more sensitive. Because I think that sometimes we and not saying that we like create the pain in our body or it's not real. Absolutely not. But sometimes in our minds, we can be, telling our bodies these messages. Like if you're constantly saying like, my pelvis sucks and it's so unstable and it's not supporting me the way it should be, that's not sending your body a very positive signal. So I really love both of those things. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. This reminds me, I used to tell myself like, oh, that's my bad knee. And I was like, oh my gosh, can you imagine? I just keep saying this is the bad knee. Now I was thinking like in terms of children, you don't just say like the one that is really being a pain that day. Oh, that's my bad kid. You would not do this.
Can you imagine?
It's the one that needs a little more love and attention right now is probably what's happening if it's acting up. And same with your pelvis. Like there's a reason why it's sending that message. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Hey everyone, we're just taking a quick break from the show to talk about energy bits. Energy bits are spirulina tablets made of one ingredient, algae. Nothing added, nothing subtracted, just 100% plant-based algae nutrition. No sugar, no caffeine, no gluten, no soy, no additives, no GMOs, no preservatives, no binders, nothing artificial. Just 100% algae, 100% green, 100% healthy, and 100% pure. Pure and simple, the way food should be. They have high protein, high beta carotene, high iron, high chlorophyll, high antioxidants, and over 40 plus vitamins, including the B vitamins. They have electrolytes, including magnesium, potassium, and are a great source of essential fatty acids. Honestly, I could go on and on and on about how great energy bits are for you, and that's why I've decided to partner with them. If you want to learn more about energy bits or order some yourself, you can head on over to energybits.com to learn more. Use the code WANDERBARN to get 20% off your order. Once again, that's energybits.com and use the code WANDERBARN for 20% off your order. All right, back to the episode. And I'm curious, so we talked a little bit about, what we can do if we're not having pain just to take care of our pelvis. And then if we're experiencing this pain and specifically like this, the pelvic girdle pain, is it the best thing to do to see like a pelvic PT, or how do we sort of, shift our lives to take care of our pelvic health?
Sure. I have a list and this is in the PDF. So no one has to you can take notes if you want. I've got like a bullet point list here for your listeners. Definitely, I would always say if it's within your means to see a pelvic health PT, please do that. Now, not everyone has one near them and not everyone can afford one. So that's why I really try and get this information out there. One thing that you can do is when you go to do something, let's say that you are picking up groceries or picking up kids, whatever it is, try exhaling on the effort. And you can even do this in your yoga classes. So usually in yoga, we will inhale into bridge. Most yoga classes I've been to, that's what we do. And I would just say, try and switch it and try and exhale into bridge. This works really well. There's a whole reason behind it in the way that the pelvic floor moves and the diaphragm moves and the intra-abdominal pressure. But I would say give it a try. Another thing you can try in your movement practice, but also going to sit anywhere at home, is can you make more space between the sits bones? So sometimes it's the pelvic floor, which is a weird word because usually if you think about the floor in your house, it's very flat.
Hard.
Hard. The pelvic floor is more like a trampoline, but it's also full of so many other things. Like there's ligaments, nerves, tendons. It's not just muscle, right? It's really complex. And I'm going to call it the pelvic floor because that's what everyone calls it, but I am starting to even look at the language of that. So if you think about the pelvic floor muscles, they run from the tailbone at the back to the sits bones out at the side and up to the pubic bone at the front. So you can actually feel your pelvic floor If you feel around, probably the easiest spot is if you're lying on your side and you wrap your hand around your sits bone, you go a little bit further than the sits bone, but not quite as far as the perineum, then you'll find that's the pelvic floor. And when we get stressed out as humans, all muscles tense up, but definitely the pelvic floor tenses up. There was a study done where people were shown, stressful images, and the pelvic floor was actually the first place to hold tension, which is really great if you're trying to outrun, some predator, but it's not great when we're in traffic every day, or like me driving with my 16-year-old who's just learning how to drive. And I'm like, okay, pelvic floor, relax. It's not danger. We're fine. And I can feel it tightening. And that will actually pull on different parts. If you think, well, it attaches to the tailbone, of course, that muscle finding tension can actually pull. So if we can find space for the sits bones, so next time you go to sit down, notice if you're tucking your tailbone as you go to sit. And if we have a lot of pelvic girdle pain, we will tuck our tailbone. And you can see animals do the same thing. When a dog is afraid, it will tuck its tailbone. So see if you can have the visualization of having really nice polka dot underwear and untucking the tailbone, and imagine that you have the skirt on, and it is not a bad thing for everyone to see your pretty polka dotted underwear, and make space at the sits bones when you go to sit down.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And thank you for the visual. That's super helpful for me as a visual learner. I feel like this is just stuff we're not taught at all,
Nope.
Even I'm a 500-hour registered yoga teacher at this point. And, even some of this is still, new information to me, which is really interesting to be in the movement space and have that. But I think just as, humans in general, we're just not taught this about our own bodies and how to take care of this. So it's just really interesting and really valuable information.
That's great. Well, I've got some more. So another one is you can try the S breath. So you just make the sound of S, all of a sudden this has become an ASMR podcast.
I love it.
But you'll make that S sound because that actually helps to engage the transversus abdominis muscles. Sometimes that can help. So if, let's say you're going to sit down, you're not maybe out in public with a bunch of people, try untucking the tailbone, really widening through the sits bones, finding the S breath, and going to sit down on that exhale. And the other thing you can do is you kind of make claw hands, make your hands into claws and bring them to the tops of the legs. Now, this is harder in a podcast to demonstrate this, but it really can make a difference when you go to sit down. Especially, I've worked with people who really dread going to sit down in a chair or have a very hard time getting back out of a chair. And this will really help. And this helps, let's say we have surgery, or we've recently given birth, or we're having that day where the low back or the pelvis is sensitive and protective. I would try it. Practicing transitions. So if you're doing a transition in a yoga practice, or you're just getting up from the floor playing with your kids, a lot of the time our transitions are really asymmetrical, meaning think of a warrior pose where one leg is forward and the other one is back or something. So is there a way that you could get up from the floor in a more symmetrical, not all the time, but when the pelvis is sensitive and protective? Some of my favorites for everyday life, because a lot of people will tell me, okay, this really hits when I'm standing. I stand all day for work, and then I feel pain in my pelvis or my low back. Then I would say, see if you can find both feet planted on the floor and then move side to side. So you press into one heel, come back to center, press into the other heel, and then see if you can add the breath with it. so that you're pressing into that heel, maybe on the exhale. And then can you inhale back to center? And that sometimes will bring a little more joy or less sensitivity to the SI joint at the back there. So that's sometimes where we feel that like, oh gosh, that dull ache of the SI joint can get really sensitive back there. So I would try that side to side or walking backwards. So we spend all day walking forwards. And if you try walking backwards, it can really ease it. So if you have a long car ride, I would try that. I have a few more. Do you want me to just keep going, or do you have any questions about those ones?
Yeah, no, those are great so far. I just wanted to comment that when I worked in retail, I definitely experienced that like lower back pain that you're talking about. And it was so interesting because I've come from the corporate world where I sat all the time. And obviously I had different, physical things going on in my body because of that. But yeah, is really interesting and kind of a new thing for me at that point was having this lower back pain that would just, at the end of probably be like around the 6.5 hour mark of an 8-hour shift, and my lower back would just be killing me. And I definitely had to work with some specialists to just strengthen my body and strengthen my pelvis and stuff, because I was definitely experiencing that pain. And then the other thing I wanted to say was, it's kind of funny. My husband, Ryan, was practicing walking backwards. He was doing it quite a bit a couple of months ago, and we're down in Mexico. And so he'd be doing it just out on the street. It's just funny. You just got to kind of own it, but it is interesting. He'd be like, do it with me. Like it's really good for your body to like train your muscles to do this. And it's hard to walk backwards. Like walking forwards is really what we've trained our body and our mind to do. And as soon as you turn it around, you have to use your muscles so differently, which is really interesting.
So true. Oh my gosh. Yes. I was doing it actually on my walk this morning because of the wind and cold. And I was like, I need to add this in. But also I'm walking like on uneven ground, and not that I ever see black bears, but we have them here. So I do want to also keep an eye on what's I have neighbors also on the trail. That's much more likely that I'd walk into a person than a black bear.
Yeah, hopefully at least. You don't want to scare a black bear when they've come out of hibernation and they're eating some berries. That's no bueno.
Yeah, it can really make a difference. So I would definitely try that. And when you were talking about I was sitting all the time and then I was standing all the time, that's another thing to look at. How can you change things so that, like, even as simple, we spend quite a bit of time now on our phones. I'm saying I mean me. Like, I'm on my phone checking.
I'm in that.
Okay, so you and I know. And so sometimes what I'll do now is lay down on the floor with my legs up the wall, or be over my exercise ball while I'm checking my phone, because it just gives me a different position than that standing or sitting. So try that out if you can. Well, and not everyone can. If we're working in retail, you are probably on your feet a lot. And go back to like the pelvis is strong and stable, and there definitely are things that you can do. Like there's a great, I'll give you a copy of this symmetry sequence. It's something that I learned from a pelvic health PT, Dr. Sinead Dufour, who trains our pelvic health PTs here in Ontario. And she modified it from Cecile Rost, who's a pelvic health PT who specializes in pelvic girdle pain. Experienced it and then said, okay, this symmetry sequence, and what that symmetry sequence basically does is both lengthen and strengthen the muscles around the pelvis. So that might be something that you work with your PT, but I'll also give all of your listeners that copy of that as well. And I had one person come to see me, and she was using a cane when she came to see me, and said that she'd been dealing with pelvic girdle pain. I mean, she said hip pain for 15 years, and it was affecting her life. Like she wasn't able to hike or walk. She came for one session. I gave her this pelvic symmetry sequence. I kind of customized it for her. And then she came back the next week and she's like, I have no pain. I haven't experienced this for years. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Like that doesn't always happen either. It's not just 1 week. Yeah. But she said, well, I've been doing it 3 times a day. I mean, I'm not saying that's the answer. It's not always more is better, but I definitely, I'm not a yoga teacher who's like, here's the recipe for not having pain in this one area in your body, and it's going to be the same for every person. But over the years of experiencing this in my own body and seeing other people, I really know these things do really make a difference usually. So there's that whole symmetry sequence.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And a few more. So there's when we're rolling over, and this is especially if we've had surgery, given birth, or we're having one of those days where the low back and the pelvis is sensitive and protective, there's a whole slow sunrise rolling over. I'm actually not sure how I would describe it to you through a podcast, but I can try and describe this, and maybe someone can do it just with my verbal cues. So lying down on your back, you'll straighten. We'll do the right leg. Straighten the right leg. Plant your left foot on the floor so the knee is bent, and then you open your left knee slightly. And when you go to roll over, you exhale and push into the left foot so that the pelvis lifts off the floor a little bit. And that's when you bring the roll over. The difference is normally when we roll over, and notice this next time you get out of bed, is we usually bend one knee and cross it over the center line. And we ask the pelvis to do this kind of like twisting, torquing movement, which when it's sensitive and protective, it doesn't really like that. So instead we can focus on, it strengthens around the glutes and asks us to do this in another way. And it also uses the breath. So I can put those cues in here as well. I think I even have a video somewhere of it online.
Yeah, no, you did a great job explaining that. I'm definitely going to try that one. Obviously, we're not on a call. I can lie down in my bed. Need like a more portable microphone.
Exactly. And the last one is questioning Kegels. So remember before when I said sometimes when the pelvic floor holds so much tension, it can cause us to feel that the pelvis is more sensitive and protective. So we don't want to then do more holding tension in the pelvic floor, which is what a Kegel basically is, or Mula Bandha if you practice yoga, that root lock. Instead, really find out from your pelvic health PT, do I need to do Kegels? And am I actually doing them correctly? Because most people aren't. So Kegels are great if they're your homework and you're going to strengthen those muscles, but it's more complex than that. We can't just at every stoplight do your Kegels because you read somewhere that you should do it.
Yeah, this is actually one thing. My friend that I was mentioning earlier who had the baby, she was saying like, oh, I thought that before I gave birth or got pregnant that I would be fine because I'd been going to the gym and training and, I did Kegels and stuff like that. And she's like, yeah, my PT told me like my transabdominal muscles were not strong and the Kegels were not really helping. Like I wasn't really doing them correctly in order to actually strengthen my pelvis. And so it's interesting that you bring that up as well, because I think that is something that we're told, like just practice that movement of clenching and unclenching. And actually in my 300-hour teacher training, when we covered a little bit of this, we were talking about how for a lot of people, it's like the pelvis might actually live in this state of clenching, which you've mentioned as well. We've got this like constant sort of stress response. And that for some of us, like relaxing is actually really hard. And I mean, that's a big important part if you're going to give birth is that you need to be able to relax those muscles. And I found that really fascinating because you think about how, we need to strengthen them, which means tightening, but in this world that we live in, when we're so stressed and tensed and hunched over all the time, sometimes relaxing the muscles is actually what we need to do. And I know you mentioned that earlier with the belly as well. We're in these tight, high-waisted jeans, we're sucking in so we look good in photos. Can we just relax the muscles a little bit?
Mm-hmm. And this is where anything restorative yoga, or on that side of things where we really have that relaxation response, helps the pelvic floor so much. Even if the pelvic floor does need more strengthening and you need Kegels at some point to help you with that, those muscles have to relax. Just like, let's say if you thought, okay, I want to strengthen my shoulders, holding tension in your shoulders all day long isn't healthy for them. They're not happy doing that. So we need to let those muscles lengthen. You cannot train tight muscle. It won't work. And oftentimes people will experience incontinence and they're like, oh, I just have to do more Kegels, and it can actually make it worse. So if ever you're doing Kegels and you can't go see a pelvic health PT, try not doing them and seeing if that makes things better. And the other thing is, don't feel bad about like, oh gosh, I wasn't doing them right. There was a whole group of pelvic health PTs who instruct people how to do Kegels, who they did a study and most of them were not doing Kegels properly. It's very subtle, and you really can only know if you have a pelvic PT who's doing an internal exam at that time, or there is like a little device that you can insert as well and see if you're getting the right muscles. If you're going to insert anything, make sure you talk to your pelvic health PT, because there are also things that you should not be inserting into the vagina. That's a whole other podcast as well.
Yeah. So many other topics we could talk about with this. It's definitely a big one. I'm curious, is there anything else you want to share today, Shannon, before we wrap up?
I think just because I said right now, like one way to test Kegels and all of this, and I was referring to a vagina, knowing that this also is the same for men. So no matter what gender you are, we all have a pelvis. We all have a pelvic floor. And I would say try it on and see if it works for you. Really, at the end of the day, all of us need to take in the information from our medical team, from our movement educators, things that we read and see, and really filter them through our own body. Like, there is no body that's like yours, and you really are the expert of your body. Like, you know best what is going on. You can listen to someone, try it out, and then take it out if it's not working. At any point, this is your right. And I would just really do your research.
Amazing. I love that. And I think that that's a really important note to make. So thank you for that. And seems like a good place to start wrapping up. I know you have amazing resources that you mentioned already that we'll make sure are in the show notes and whatnot. I know you also have Pelvic Health Professionals, your membership. Can you tell listeners about that and where they can go find more about you?
Sure. If you go to pelvichealthprofessionals.com, then you can check out all of the free resources that we have there all about pelvic health. So if you just want to learn more about how your pelvis works, go check it out. If you're a yoga teacher or movement educator or anyone who works with individuals with a pelvis, then you can also join our membership and be part of our membership calls. And I will get this PDF ready for you. Do you want me to put it over I can put it at pelvichealthprofessionals.com/matcha if you want. Does that work?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Then I'll do that.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And if people want to follow you on social, where's the best place to go?
Probably either at Pelvic Health Professionals on Instagram or at The Connected Yoga Teacher on Instagram. I'm on Facebook too, but I really like to hang out on Instagram lately.
Yeah, for sure. I feel that also. Amazing. Thank you for this conversation, Shannon. This has been so good. And it's just got my brain moving with so many good thoughts and things I want to continue to learn and whatnot. So thank you for chatting with me today.
Well, thank you for having me. I am so excited that we get to chat and actually make it into a podcast episode because you and I chat a lot. And I'm just really excited about the work that you're doing in the world all over the place because you're like the podcast queen. You have many podcasts. So it's just exciting to get to hang out and chat.
Amazing. Thank you so much.